Thank you so much, Kathryn, for such a wonderful presentation. We all really enjoyed it, both here and around the world. In some ways, your approach to studying these free living dogs is that of an ecologist. You're observing a wild animal in its natural environment over time and without hands-on human interaction, aside from the dumping of garbage that they feed on. So in some ways, it's similar to, say, vultures or bears that are studied by ecologists. Why do you think some people, find it hard to view Canis familiaris in this way?
I think it goes back to what I said at the beginning. Most of us who are, have this kind of interest in dogs do so because we have dogs in our lives, and we're used to viewing them as pets or working animals, very closely related to us. Even Darwin made this mistake when he was talking about evolution. He used dogs as an example of how this could happen by talking about artificial selection. And he assumed, because that's what they were doing at that time, dog breeding was very popular at the time, that is what has been happening always. But that's a false assumption. I hate to say that about Darwin, because I'm an evolutionary biologist, but even he was subject to potential false assumptions. So because we see something the way it is now, it does not mean that that's the way it's always been. And I think that's a common human, even with our amazing mental time travel that we found out about yesterday, we sometimes make these errors.
So just also bringing it into some conversations we'll have in the afternoon, what future directions do you hope for your research, and also what types of funding would you need to do or assess the questions that you have?
So those things are very closely related. I have a large number of projects, and which one I do really depends on the funding I get. So one nice thing about animal behavior is it is possible to do without funding, but it's a lot easier to do with funding. And some projects are impossible without funding. So you can kind of eke along for a while doing some things without major funding, which I've done a lot of. But it's, it's windfall when you get some. And as Prescott mentioned, it's rare to have a big grant that's specifically for dogs. So usually we're competing, for example, in my area, I'm competing with everybody else doing animal behavior, which is not usually on dogs. So dogs are a great model for some reasons. I'm particularly interested in them because of the evolutionary comparison we can make with two living groups, right? We have our wild canis, who are still alive and extremely closely related to each other and to dogs, and we have dogs who are so different behaviorally, genetically really not that different from everybody else, but behaviorally so different, and they're both still here and we can look at them. Now, they probably aren't directly related, but they're very closely related. They're close enough that we can make some inferences. And so that makes them fascinating, but they aren't like rats. We can't have enormous ants or insects. They're not really easy to keep in a lab, and we, kind of frown on keeping dogs in a lab in some cases. And so it hasn't been a really big study subject, and because of that, sometimes it's difficult to get funding because people go, "Oh, you're looking at dogs," and we talked about the degenerate. They're degenerate. We have been doing stuff to them for a long time, and so people say, they're not real animals. And what I'm trying to say is, no, look, they are real animals. They've been evolving all by themselves for a long time, and the vast majority of dogs, there's no evidence that we have ever had control over the vast majority of dogs on this planet, and we still don't. And so they're very interesting, and that's not a popular thing right now.
And if someone was watching with a blank check and they really liked your talk, what would I do with it? What's a question you'd like to look at? Yeah.
There's so many. So one thing I've been looking at recently, it's actually a study that I've started and would like to go further with, is looking at the connection of hunting behaviors. So comparing how different breeds of dogs and wolves actually develop these sequences. So as I talked about, wolves have this really complex hunting behavior, and it's been lost in the village dogs, but we've actually manipulated it in breeds. So for example, a border collie has a little portion of this really complicated hunting pattern. They leave out the last, kill bite, but they have the rest of it. Or like Schutz and German Shepherds have they jump over the eye stalk, but they have the eye, the orient, the chase, and the bite, right? And so how did we do that? How did that happen? We selected for it on the end side, right? We're like, I like that behavior, I'll breed that dog, but how did that actually happen? And we think it's developmental, so we think it has to do with when different genes turn on. And so I've started a study where I've been looking at that, but I'd like to continue a bit more of that, and that would take thousands of hours of coding, so it would involve some funding.
And some grad students.
And a whole bit. Well, I usually use undergrads, so, but they are equally good.
Well, thank you so much, Kathryn.